Hi, my name's Chandira and I live in the small market town of Glastonbury in Somerset. It's a unique place that I love more than anything because of all its myths and legends. It's an important place for the pagan community and the Christian community alike, and some people see it as the spiritual centre of England. Throughout the programme, I'd like to take you on a journey around Glastonbury and to show you a few of the lesser known facts and the more interesting places. Local author Geoffrey Ash has written a number of books about Glastonbury, and I began by asking him what he feels is so special about the place.
Glastonbury is a myth-making place. In fact, I think the first thing I'd like to do is quote one of the wisest things I ever heard said about Glastonbury, that you have only to tell some crazy story here, and in 10 years' time it's ancient Somerset legend. The Glastonbury presence is very, very old. It goes back thousands of years. Now, whether this is originally the goddess in the landscape, whether it is the earliest Christian element, whether it's a sort of accumulation of things, I think it's difficult to tell. But it is a very powerful presence. And one thing I've noticed is what I've called the Glastonbury madness. Notoriously, people who believe too much about Glastonbury go more or less mad, but what's not so much noticed is scholars who try to debunk Glastonbury also go mad, and I often notice this.
Well, I'm not completely crazy yet. Behind me is one of the famous landmarks, Glastonbury Tor. You can see this Tor pretty much from whichever direction you come into town from. It's one of the first things you see, and it's very recognisable with the church tower on top of it. It has the ability to mysteriously reappear and disappear depending on which direction you're travelling in from. Rising up above the flat meadowlands, there are numerous myths and legends associated with Glastonbury Tor. It's supposed to be the home of the Lord of the Underworld. One rather odd thing is that you can't actually see the Tor from Glastonbury itself unless you get round the hills a little bit.
And of course in ancient times the tower wouldn't have been on top, so it would have been more difficult to see. This is quite true. It appears and disappears. If you're driving through Somerset, you will suddenly say, oh look, there's the Tor in the distance, and by the time you've spotted it, you're past. There's a place in the direction of Wincanton where just for a few yards in a lane you can see Glastonbury Tor on your right, Cadbury Castle on your left, and that vanishes when you go a little way. And this is true in many parts of the county. The Tor appears and disappears. It's strange, it's elusive, like many other things around here.
One thing that you'll notice about the Tor is that it's surrounded by ridges, a bit like this one I'm standing on, and it's been suggested that they form an ancient maze design.
As you know, there are several what might be called fringe theories about Glastonbury, like the zodiac and the ley lines and so on. And orthodox archaeologists won't have anything to do with the zodiac or the ley lines, but at least one very distinguished one who excavated the Tor, who is very sceptical about the Glastonbury legend, still thinks that maze may be real. And I find that very interesting. I cannot see how this formation could be found on the Tor unless it was really there. It's all very well to say these are medieval strip lynchets or something, but I have never seen a hill anywhere else like that. And for it to happen here is beyond coincidence, I think.
There's speculation that the three-dimensional Neolithic labyrinth is the remains of a ritual path, perhaps a ceremonial way dedicated to an ancient British goddess. When the pattern was discovered on the Tor, it was first assumed that it just went round and round in a spiral, but if you do that, you go round 3 times and come up against a central ridge, and you don't get any further.
The possible answer is this rather more complicated pattern, round and back 7 times, which is certainly a very important magical or religious design in many places. You find it in Ireland, in Wales, in Italy, in Greece. I've seen an instance in India. It's the principal sacred symbol of the Hopi in Arizona. They call it the Mother Earth symbol. It seems to have been something very widespread, and you can find it on the Tor. And I just don't think that it would just have happened through an earthquake or anything of that sort. It is real. You'd have to go quite a way back for it, because you have to go back to a period in this country where people did go to an enormous amount of trouble to make ritual works. Stonehenge, Avebury, Silbury and so forth, 2000 BC or so, but it might have been used later, of course.
Coincidentally, the cottage now lived in by the author Geoffrey Ashe was once the home of Dion Fortune, who during the 1920s and 1930s carried out a lot of things that were significant to the inner life of Glastonbury. She ran her home as a sort of esoteric hostel. Conveniently situated at the foot of Glastonbury Tor, it had accommodation for guests who came to study spiritual matters, and there was even a temple on the premises.
Dion Fortune, whose original name is Violet Firth, was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which did a lot to revive interest in magic and kindred topics around the turn of the 20th century. And like most of these organisations, people split off from it and formed their own. She formed the Society of the Inner Light. And she believed that Glastonbury was the great spiritual centre of the West, and she decided to come here to teach her doctrines and so forth.
She's known as an occultist, really. She wrote some very interesting novels in the 1920s and 1930s, and she was based sort of partly in Glastonbury and partly in London, and she wrote a little book about Glastonbury called Avalon of the Heart. And a lot of the things that she did then, I feel, were very, very significant in the inner life of Glastonbury and the way things have worked out since.
I think she is more sensible than a lot of occultish writers, when I can understand her, and sometimes I can and sometimes not. She's very much of her time. I mean, one of her books is called something like Magic and the Servant Problem. Well, you know, that's very dated. And she was well known locally, of course, a very big woman, I gather, who went around in a long cape. But no, there's no linkage, although someone told me, who had been involved in spiritualism, that Dion Fortune had come through in San Francisco. I don't know what her spirit was doing there, and said she'd read some of my books and she approved of me, which is very nice to know. I want to know how one's books get into the spirit world and how you collect royalties on them when they do.
Dion Fortune coordinated some rather unusual activities during the Second World War, as local lecturer Paul Weston explains.
Yeah, well, I've often felt that what happened around Glastonbury during the Second World War was perhaps Glastonbury's finest hour, and that if nothing else, whatever the general public may think of magic and mysticism, represents a very unusual bit of social history that so far has been neglected in other accounts of that period. A lot of people now are familiar with the fact that there was a certain occult dimension to the Second World War. People know that the Nazis were involved in the occult, that they had an interest there, that was a serious one.
Whilst it was common knowledge that the swastika emblem was derived from an ancient symbol of the occult, it was also felt that dark spiritual forces were at work which needed to be dealt with.
It's also becoming more clear now that there was a British response to that there were certain people in Britain who recognised what was going on and felt they needed to bring out their own response.
During the days of the Battle of Britain, Dion Fortune became the focal point for a group of people up and down the country who had an interest in the occult and in magic. She used to send out letters to them every single week containing details for making a united meditation. All around the country, on a Sunday morning, this selection of people would sit in the quietness of their own homes and close their eyes and imagine that they could see Glastonbury Tor.
And then they would try and enter into Glastonbury Tor as if there was a huge, great hollow cavern inside it. What was being seen was an enormous, great golden cross with a red rose on it, hanging in the middle of the air inside this imagined cavern in Glastonbury Tor. Above it was an image of Christ, and below it could be seen the Virgin Mary, and on either side of it were King Arthur and Merlin. And this whole set of imagery, as far as the people participating were concerned, emerged out of, the depths of the collective mind of Britain.
By focusing on these figures, which represented the combined force of Christianity and the tradition of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, it was thought that Britain would be better protected in its hour of need. They believed that these things had a very real effect on the way things were going.
Whatever we might think of that, whether we think that's nonsense or not, the fact that Glastonbury was the spiritual focus of the magical Battle of Britain is something that I think is very important in determining how this place and the strange haunting image of the Tor resonate in the collective mind at a very deep level.
From her letters and the things that she said about what was happening, it's clear that Dion Fortune also felt that what was going on at the time was important for what would happen after the war and the regeneration of the national psyche as she felt it. Paul Weston has since found that there have been certain occasions when similar meditations have seemed appropriate for more recent events.
At the time of the death of Princess Diana, for example, whatever people thought about all the furore surrounding it and the way people responded to it, it was quite obviously a mythological event of some kind. I got a group of people together who were interested, and we essentially recreated the meditation of that period, 1940, but updated it to include imagery surrounding the royal family and so on, and a sense of continuity, because the original imagery brings together the pagan and the Christian. Arthur, and Merlin, although people try and Christianise them, they just about succeed with King Arthur, but there's no doubt about the fact that Merlin represents a very archaic lineage. He's like a folk memory of the Druids. All of this stuff is a mythos surrounding the issue of sovereignty, and because of the things that were happening with Diana being finally buried on an island in the middle of a lake, and people talking about her as the Lady of the Lake, this was such an unusual archetypal theme that really people aren't familiar with, and yet there it was, surfacing very strongly. It seemed appropriate to connect up with the Arthurian mythos.
Another special feature of Glastonbury is the number of spiritual healers and therapists here who can provide guidance and can provide a remedy for most ailments. Here is the Bridget Healing Centre right in the middle of town.
One of the reasons I advertise myself as an aromatherapist and masseur is really because I see it as a gateway for people coming in. The oils actually have a physical mode of action, if you like. So it's an obvious way in, and I think people may not approach a spiritual healer or acupuncturist because they're frightened of having needles in them, will come to an aromatherapist.
It's not necessarily everybody's path to do healing work in the sense of one-to-one healing work, although everything can be healing work anyway. And if that feels that it is the right thing to do, then it is to really look at the self and discover yourself and find out what may be in yourself which is preventing you from totally being yourself. So the healing process has to start from within first.
You do get a fair few clients who come because they've been diagnosed with a serious illness. It may or may not be terminal, it may be something like eczema or severe stress or sciatica or frozen shoulders, as well as people with cancer or whatever. And that orthodox medicine isn't really helping the situation at all. In fact, the drugs that they're on may be producing more side effects, which the side effects may well be worse than what they're trying to treat.
If it's done in a safe environment where the person feels safe and they can trust the person that is regressing them, they can go into a very, very deep place, which is where many of those causes of the blocks come from. And by accessing the causes and by re-experiencing the causes in a very safe way without feeling threatened, then those causes can be actually released from the subconscious, and then it gives a chance for new, more positive states of being to take the place of those more negative states that have been actually released from the person.
One particular way I've been training recently is with an area of aromatherapy called Momogenera, where you're smelling oils or mixes of oils, and this evokes memories or images. The nearest thing, I suppose, is a little bit like hypnoregression or something like that, hypnotherapy, where the person smells the oils with their eyes closed and all these images come up. And people who have been quite sceptical at the beginning of, say, a 6-session series have been convinced. They say, well, I don't know how it's worked, but I know it's worked, and I know I feel better, and I know I feel different, or I'm not so depressed, or whatever.
Rune readings are said to be a way of finding your own self-nature and having it communicated to you by the person giving the reading. They differ from other methods such as tarot cards.
And so each rune has a certain keyword and a certain energy connected with it. So in a reading with a different layout, the combination of the meaning of the rune and the position that it falls in determines what information comes through. And so sometimes it takes a bit longer to access the runic energy, but when you do access it, it can take it to a very deep level, and the runes are a very direct means of communication. The Bridget Healing Centre is a centre for complementary therapy, healing and consciousness raising. It has evolved into a centre which is run by the healers and therapists who are a part of it. It's like a real container.
Glastonbury is proud of its so-called alternative community. Although it's sometimes a bit of a balancing act in dealing with the establishment, there's plenty of optimism for the future.
Like, for example, myself being a governor at the school, that's like someone from the more alternative part of the community going in and being sort of what might be called a more straight role. In the 10 years or so that I've been here, I think that I can see that there are more of the alternative section are setting up businesses which are surviving and are, I don't know how much money they are making, but at least they're still there 5 or 6 years down the road. And that says to me that we're making inroads and we're becoming not more respectable, but more viable as an alternative community. I suppose I criticise the people who are outside it in terms of lumping together the people who are up the high street drinking or obviously dealing and on drugs and so on, lumping them in with the alternative section. And somehow the alternative sector of Glastonbury seems to carry that part of Glastonbury, whereas it could as easily be ascribed to the orthodox sector of Glastonbury or the local section.
Given everything that happens here in Glastonbury, how do you think children fit into the community?
My children cope very well. They actually like living here. They say they don't want to live anywhere else. If I talk about moving to other towns or moving to Hertfordshire, where I come from. But in terms of choosing where to live, I think it's a good place. It's almost like you get the cosmopolitan aspect, but you can still see green hills and fields as you're walking to school in the morning.
For anybody interested in reading up on spiritual matters, you'd be hard-pressed to find a more diverse bookshop than the Speaking True bookshop here. Some people call these books alternatives, but the shop's owner, Gareth, doesn't quite put it like that.
I've never found one word that really covered the subject. Mind, body, spirit, esoteric, occult, metaphysical, new age, they're all terms which come close. Spiritual comes close as well. But if it were possible to encapsulate it, to cover it in a term, they wouldn't be quite as magical as they are. We're a spiritual centre, whatever that means. People come here looking for something beyond the material. If you have no need for anything beyond the material, then I guess you don't need to come here. If you do want that little bit extra, that little bit of magic, you're more likely to find it here than anywhere else.
What's your own personal reason for coming to Glastonbury in the first place?
I don't know how I came to Glastonbury. I cycled out of London one day, and this is as far as I got by sunset. And I've been here ever since. I wouldn't leave now. I love the place. I think we tend to get a little bit elitist and a little bit smug and self-satisfied. We're here, we're transforming ourselves, aren't we wonderful? And anybody else from the outside really doesn't know what it's all about. And when I first came here, I thought, what are these people on? You know, how dare they? But, and here I am, I'm just as bad 7 years on. Worse, probably. We could do with, we'd kick up the arse sometimes, really.
Now, given the diverse nature of what actually happens here in Glastonbury, do you see it as a place that can offer spiritual enlightenment or spiritual confusion?
Both. You can't have one without the other. What will enlighten me on a Tuesday will confuse the hell out of me on a Wednesday. But the very fact that we choose to call ourselves a spiritual centre means that that's what we are. London's a financial and political centre, we're a spiritual centre. Perhaps what we hope to see in this century is the one being seen as important as the other, or more so.
Another source of inspirational literature is the Library of Avalon. It carries a selection of over 8,500 books on legends, religion, spiritualism and related topics, and is a popular place for researchers. And of course it houses books written by local author Geoffrey Ashe.
I had a book come out in the autumn called The Book of Prophecy, where I discuss various prophecies and real or false, whether they work and whether they don't, and where they come from, the significance of Merlin, the significance of the return of Arthur and themes of that kind, but various other things. I've got 2 chapters on Nostradamus. I think I'm probably the only person who has studied Nostradamus and stayed completely sane. I find him very interesting, if you can get rid of the nonsense. And he didn't predict anything in modern times at all. They're quite wrong about that, you know. And last year, if you recall, they all said he'd said the world was going to end on July the 4th. Well, it didn't, and it's a pity that they said this, because he never said anything remotely like that. I don't know who got that idea. A lot of the ideas about Nostradamus are like that. And, of course, they discredit him, because the world doesn't end, but he never said it would.
Glastonbury has a magnetic pull and it attracts people in from near and far. The town's population is quite a colourful bunch of characters. People seem to be drawn here through their own personal search or brought here by some strange twist of fate.
I ended up here as a mistake. To get off the subject. It was a mistake, or was it? I don't know. I ended up here one wet Tuesday night, up by the White Spring, with nowhere to go and really not even a proper sleeping bag. You know. Yeah. It was like unwise for a man of 40, really, wasn't it? You know? Thinking, what am I going to do now? I tried chanting, nothing happened. I tried a few other things, and I thought, I'm really having trouble, aren't I? And I got offered a place to stay. Somebody appeared out of the shadows and offered me a place to stay. I've been here since. I refused to leave. When I came here, I think I took it all a bit lightly to begin with. But when I started asking the goddess, whoever she may be, or you perceive her to be, for things, and when those things came, it didn't necessarily appear or manifest is a word I hear a lot in Glastonbury, that you think they would.
Yeah.
So yeah, I got my heart's desires, but then what? Okay, well, we're giving you all the physical and material things you need to sustain life. Now what are you going to do? You know, now what?
So, what would be your main piece of advice for anyone coming into Glastonbury on some kind of spiritual search?
Get on a bus out of town, the nearest bus. Don't stop. Don't speak to strangers. Don't speak to Buddha Ron. Just get on a bus and leave.
Yeah.
That's what I would advise them to do. But actually they don't take any notice, because you meet them 3 days later and they're wrapped in a tablecloth eating wild garlic. With wild staring eyes. Honestly, I've met them. I've been here 4 years, I've met Guinevere 5 times. And she never looks the same. Honestly. Ooh, please. Jesus twice, I kicked him up the front.
We had Gordon the Christ Day here, didn't we?
Yes. I don't know if you know Wells, but Jesus has reincarnated as a guy called Gordon. Now, maybe I'm stupid, but I don't think our Lord would actually come back as somebody called Gordon.
I think you might be right.
Have I got this totally wrong? Or?
I don't think so. No.
I mean, I know he's got a sense of humour, but Gordon? No.
I suggested if he really was the Christ, he'd help me cook dinner, and he was so outraged.
This particular incarnation of madness,
chop onions, you know. Before enlightenment, fetch wood and water. After enlightenment, fetch wood and water.
Chop onions.
Chop onions. I think you mustn't lose sight about actually what Glastonbury is really about, you know, about being the heart chakra. So I'm told. I mean, you know, to me, you know, this is extraordinary for me, because really I'm just a hairdresser from Essex that along the years has stumbled and ended up here in Glastonbury.
It is an open-air psychiatric.
It really is.
Glastonbury is the first experimental open-air psychiatric unit. But nobody's worked that out yet.
I remember being in a hot tub once talking about my life history, and somebody asked the chappie across in the hot tub next to me what he did. He said he was a social worker. I held my nose and dived under the water, and he pulled me out. So I freeze up if I know what people do in the world. I call it in the world. I'm not very good out there, actually. On a mundane level, the tour means 8 times a year I get to see how fit and healthy I am, and I check in with my life. I was just up there this morning. There's the equinoxes, the spring equinox and the September equinox, and then the solstices and the fire festivals, and it's lots of fun. And it's a time to check in. It's a time where all kinds of people get and stand in the circle. You know, it's not like organisations. It's like everyone troops somewhere, whether it's Stonehenge or Avebury, and we meet up with old friends and find out what they've been doing over the last few moon turns.
Hail to thee, O Sun, who gives life to the entire universe.
Hail to thee, O Sun, who gives life to the entire universe.
It's relevant to these times. I mean, this is the new millennium. Everyone's searching for the meaning of life, whatever that is. And we've already seen that religions don't work anymore, and masters don't work anymore. We have to be our own masters and our own mistresses. And yet we also have to be a community. So there has to be a middle way where we can all be responsible for ourselves. Truth, honour and integrity. But still be able to come together and stand in circle and share with each other, standing alone. And that for me is what the sacred sites mean, actually. It doesn't really matter what mantle we wear. I guess I actually believe that everything happens perfectly in its right time, and I'd just like to see Glastonbury getting on with it, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Get its drains sorted out. So
Oh
they
yeah,
don't
drains
sink.
would be good.
Apart from that, you know, what can I say? I could, but I won't.
Throughout Glastonbury there's evidence of both its Christian roots and its pagan connection. Although traditionally both sides have been pretty intolerant of each other, there's more of a willingness here to explore the common ground than there is in most other places.
Whenever the world faced a major crisis, people would start looking towards the historical focal points of spiritual endeavour throughout the world, and many of these, of course, are in origin what we might call pagan, which can become a term of abuse, which it should never become, because it really means country people or the ordinary people. And if it's looked at in that light, then it doesn't become a word with bad associations, which it very often has become. And so anybody who's a pagan automatically gets condemned.
I think it depends very much on the Christian and the pagan. I mean, you cannot lump all the pagans together and say it's one thing, it's many things. You cannot lump all Christians together and say it's one thing, that also is many things. And in some cases there is a very real opposition. A fundamentalist Christian will reject everything pagan, and some pagans reject everything Christian for one reason or another. But I think there can be a very real overlap. You can see some kind of wisdom or inspiration coming from the pagan side that does mesh with Christian tradition.
The Abbey Ruins are visited by thousands of people every year, and in its heyday this abbey was the biggest abbey in the country. It was destroyed in 1539 by King Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, and the last abbot was hung on the Tor. One of the last members of the monastic community here prophesied that one day the abbey would be restored, and when that happened, prosperity would follow for the rest of the town.
But what he actually said was that the abbey will one day be repaired and restored for the like worship which has ceased, and then peace and plenty will for a long time abound. Now, of course, he saw the rebirth in the only way he could think of it, as a former member of the community which had been destroyed. But I would still say yes. I would like to see that in some sense literally fulfilled.
There are many people that would love to see it rebuilt. There are prophecies saying that one day it will be. Let's be realistic about that. There's no chance of it happening in the physical world. The amount of money and resources necessary, the archaeological problems of what you would do with the ruins already there, whether it's even morally appropriate to spend that amount of money in a climate where you've got so many other good causes. Each year they have a pilgrimage, the Church of England and the day after the Catholic Church. What surprises me is that nobody's done the obvious yet. You watch so many programmes where you see these computer graphic reconstructions of old cathedrals and old buildings. Remarkably realistic, very evocative things. I'm just totally amazed that no one has done this with Glastonbury Abbey yet, because the possibilities are absolutely immense. At the end of the day, you could have virtual pilgrimage to Glastonbury Abbey.
In fact, the idea of a computer graphic reconstruction of Glastonbury Abbey had already been put to the Abbey's board. However, they felt that any such reconstruction would need to be 100% authentic, and that the main drawback of that was that it would require accurate knowledge of the finer details of the original Abbey, which are simply not available. Although books have been written which describe in great detail what the Abbey may have looked like, at the end of the day it's pure conjecture. Similarly, there have been people who claim to have received information from the spirit world about the inner decorations of the Abbey, together with lists of statues and relics. But whether it be wise to rely on such things as the sole source of information is another matter.
It would be a remarkable project for a load of artists, architectural historians, experts on the church to build a virtual reality Glastonbury Abbey. I think it would be incredibly powerful, and it would certainly be a lot cheaper than actually rebuilding it. From that point on, you could do the pilgrimage and make the connection in your own home.
A gentleman by the name of Bly Bond was one of the most controversial figures ever to have arisen in Glastonbury. He was an architectural historian who worked in the town at a time when the Abbey Ruins were purchased for the Church of England in 1908. He was permitted to lead the archaeological excavations, although some of his methods raised a few eyebrows and then began to be frowned upon. He had a background in the more esoteric side of the study of church architecture. Also, he believed in some kind of secret tradition that had been handed down through the Masons, whereby the geometry of the ground plan of churches through the Middle Ages apparently had some secret meaning connected with number codes and proportion, but he was also interested in psychic matters.
He had a friend who practised automatic writing, and they knew from some of the old records of the Abbey that there was supposedly a chapel that they had yet to find any real signs of. So they did the experiment of asking, as it were, the departed spirits of the monks at Glastonbury Abbey whether they could help them. Automatic writing followed in a kind of mixture of different scripts that were suggestive of a whole mishmash of Old English and Latin and so on. That led them to uncover the ruins of the Edgar Chapel. So in other words, this appeared to be a direct hit. And he went through a period of time where he was using these methods and getting definite results out of it. Unfortunately, this sort of boosted his confidence and made him a little bit unrealistic, in as much as there was never going to be any way that the church authorities at that period of time would ever really accept that kind of methodology. He published the results of his work and how he'd come to them in a book called The Gate of Remembrance. This resulted in a whole load of lingering controversy. Eventually he lost his post and was not able to continue anymore. For a long time his name was anathema around Glastonbury Abbey.
Many years on, and we find that Bly Bond did eventually go down in history as someone who contributed a great deal to providing the historical detail of Glastonbury Abbey. Despite all the controversy he caused at the time, today he features prominently in the Museum of the Abbey's history.
But the whole idea that there are mysteries of hidden proportions and geometry and some secret tradition in the foundations of Glastonbury Abbey is one of the mainstays of the new beliefs that have come up around this place. Many people have suggested that the same proportions, the same dimensions, the same secret tradition can be found in places like Stonehenge and the Great Pyramid. All of this is very contentious, but it's a heady brew, and if you follow the train of thought, you will find yourself going on a very interesting journey indeed.
So, as you can see, there's more to Glastonbury than first meets the eye. I suppose that's why people find it so appealing, and that's what brings people here from all walks of life. So until next time, bye bye.